Literally.
And on that note, are you good to go?
John, we'd love to see it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here tonight with huge thanks to ARP Books to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of Black Women Under State: Surveillance, Poverty, and the Violence of Social Assistance by Idil Abdillahi. We're so delighted to have Idil here and so grateful to all of you for joining us here physically and virtually for all of you watching online. I won't take up too much of your time out of the gate, just a few quick housekeeping notes, and then I get to introduce the two wonderful participants this evening. So there'll be a bit of a conversation here, and then we'll turn things over to questions from the audience. I'll have this wireless microphone that I can run up to you with. Even if you can project, please do use the microphone. It's just for the benefit of those watching online so they can hear your question. And if you do happen to be one of those watching online, please feel free to just write your question in the chat, and we'll put the questions to Idil as time permits. Now, following that, we'll move along to the signing, and I'll have some thrilling notes about signing procedure immediately at the close of the event. But for right now, we are here to talk about this incredible book. The lives and conditions of Black women are inseparable from and inextricably linked to all dimensions of social and political life. Black Women Under State centers on the realities of Black women, both in process and theory, who are living at the intersections of race, poverty, surveillance, and social services. Black Women Under State contributes to filling a gap in social policy literature, which has typically disregarded the subjective experiences of Black women or treated them as a mere addendum. Now, Idil Abdillahi is an assistant professor in the School of Disability Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson. A critical interdisciplinary scholar, she has published on a wide array of topics such as mental health, poverty, HIV/AIDS, organizational development, and several other key policy areas at the intersection of Black life and state interruption. Most notably, Abdillahi's cutting-edge research and scholarship on anti-Black Satanism has informed the current debates on fatal police shootings of Black man-identified peoples. Satanism, I'm sorry. She co-authored Black Life, Post-BLM, and The Struggle for Freedom, which is an incredible book, also published by ARP Books, and is currently working on her forthcoming book, Blackened Madness: Medicalization and Black Everyday Life in Canada, which will also be published by the good folks at ARP. Abdillahi is the newest addition to the editorial team of Mad Matters, a critical reader in Canadian Mad Studies, published by Canadian Scholars Press. Your host for the evening, the editor of this volume, is Irene Bindi. She's an artist and an editor at ARP Books based in Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg. Her artwork and design adorns the cover of this book. And in addition to all of those things, as I always mention, she is an incredible thinker, filmmaker, and just cultural theorist, individual in general. So it's always such a thrill to have her behind the microphone as well. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Idil Abdillahi and Irene Bindi.
Thank you so much, John, for the generous introduction. I'm really happy to finally be here with Idil. The last time that she was in Winnipeg was for the launch of Black Life. Since then, which is another book that like ARP had the good fortune to be able to publish. Since sort of diving into this one, which I think we started in the spring of 2020, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be like constantly referencing my notes because I have like goldfish brain at this point. But working with Idil has been this really amazing process. Because, not just because, but we became friends very early on and developed a real comradeship and have had a lot of exchange beyond the scope of the text as well into our own lives and other work. And I've learned so much from Idil. She's been a really huge part of my own political development in recent years. So I want to say that to start. Idil asked me to introduce the text, so I'll do a bit of preamble and then maybe we can move on to discuss with more detail some of the issues that it takes up. When I was preparing for this and thinking about what it is that her book uniquely does, in the most skeletal, descriptive sense, it focuses on the experiences of 20 Black women in Toronto and specifically their experience with social assistance, the Ontario Works program. But that description is somewhat deceptive because it doesn't encompass the fact that this book is microcosmic and therefore ultimately pretty expansive in its exploration. And letting people know about this event, I said that we have a lot to learn from Idil about inter and intra-institutionally connected racial and gendered violence. So the workings both within systems and in between various systems and how they inform one another and feedback and prop up and create engines that almost barely need to be tended for these harmful racist views and therefore policies and actions that follow that keep this violence circulating and firmly in place. So in that sense, its scope is societal as well, I think. So one of the biggest achievements of the book, and this is reflected in all of Idil's various practices as well, in teaching and speaking, working within communities, is of concretizing the interconnectedness of these systems and how you can't really discuss one part, like policing, for instance, as the most obvious example of this without discussing all of the others. So you can't talk about the surveillance of Black women who seek social assistance as this kind of isolated harm, because all of the circumstances and built systems that converge to make that surveillance possible in its many forms are social, legal, media, governmental, and policy-based. And within each of these systems, there is permission, a kind of given, to treat and view Black women as less than human, less than deserving, and therefore as disposable. And Idil doesn't just discuss, she demonstrates this in this book with great clarity. Related to her clarity, another big takeaway is that the actual violence of systems of violence are hidden. And when I say violence, I mean in the way that Idil uses it, as in every sense of harm, physical, psychological, etc. That these things are hidden in various ways from view, and the things that cannot be hidden from view are hidden in that they are normalized culturally and through this regularization of an entire range of accepted views and practices. One of the things that I think Idil brings to her writing and all of her work and just basic interfacing with the world, and it's tied, I think, to this clarity of purpose, are these skills of demystification and of constant clarification. And the importance of that, I think, can't be overestimated because of the stakes of the perpetuation of these dangers, this violence, that are the result of levels of state and systemic obfuscation, covering not simply what is happening, the mechanics, the history, the reasoning behind these systems, and what is and shouldn't be permissible that is done to these Black women on a direct material level. So all of the hoops, the paperwork, the environment of interrogation that these women have to endure, the geographic difficulty of accessing assistance, these things that are normalized, and this broader cultural and culturally accepted obfuscation of dehumanization persistently being muddled and cloaked in a neoliberal disguise of free and open and equitable society that views everyone as equally human and worthy. So maybe to start, because I think some of the reasons for this text's expansiveness have to do with your own direct experience within and access to various systems, which really run a gamut, people may not realize, in terms of the perspectives that you bring to this text. Maybe we can start there if you'd like to situate your own relationship to the subjects that Black women understate takes up.
Thank you so much, Irene. Like, that was such a beautiful, thoughtful, and expansive introduction. I feel like my mouth is too close to the mic, my bad. So maybe before I answer your question, I may want to begin by firstly thanking all of you that are here. It's super cold in Winnipeg. I wore like running shoes and socks and like no long johns, and I'm Black. And that's a thing. So thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you all for supporting the work of like activist presses that I think is super important, particularly during a time that there's like a paper crisis in the world, and in particular here in Canada. And so I think that that's important. So I think I want to thank you all for like making the movements to be in the space, for choosing to be in the space. So I see every single one of you, and I asked Irene if I can thank all of you individually, and she said do it after the talk, right? So I see all of you. I'm going to talk to all of you, and I'm going to thank all of you individually, because this is like super exciting and huge for me. So thank you all for choosing to be here. I honor you and hold you, and hope that we can exchange something this evening that is meaningful for all of us. So thank you. Secondly, I'd like to thank ARP. Specifically, I'd like to thank the commitment of ARP as an activist press, and hopefully if you buy the book, in the acknowledgements, you can read the importance of the work of ARP for me, particularly, and I think it's important to name names, because that's the work that I do generally in my practice. So I'm going to go ahead and name Todd, who's right back there. Todd, who stuck with this book for so long, even though I didn't send back the contract for a super long time. I also want to go ahead and thank Brent, who's here, who's my big homie, who like encourages and supports me on the gram and like deals with my messy. I want to go ahead and shout out Andrew, who's like super new for me to ARP, who's been great in terms of like the communications and helping to make sure that I do the things that I need to do, even though I don't respond to emails fast enough. And I'm super weird, so Andrew, holla, right? And then to Irene. Wow, I don't know what to say about you, Irene, because this book was written across seas. This book was written across the Atlantic. This book was written throughout like my own like state surveillance, deprivation, struggle, disability, and like you literally rode. And Irene Bindi also is the artist of the cover of this book. And I specifically chose Irene as the artist and cover for this book because Irene sat with this book for a very, very, very long time. And so like, while the book is about Black women, I think there's a particular kind of like narrative and like artist practice in the struggle of like supporting and getting us through it. And so Irene specifically understood this book in a way that I think other people couldn't commit to, and probably like wouldn't deal with all of my madness, my rankness, like I talk about in the book, and my misfittedness, my auto-oddness, and like my writing outside of the pages. And so Irene, there aren't enough words to thank you. So thank you. I honor you, I hold you, and I appreciate you as my editor and the illustrator of the cover of this book. So thank you so much. And again, thank you to ARP, thank you to Todd, thank you to Andrew, and thank you to Brent, who've become friends, and people like that I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but like I otherwise fuck with, period. So on that note, Irene, I'll, I guess, refer back to your question. So you have, what did you say? You have goldfish brain? So I have like fog everyday brain. So give me a part of the question, and I think I may have a part of the book to read. I don't love reading from the book, but I'll read from a little bit of the book to respond to Irene's question. So Irene, maybe you want to like give me a bit of a prompt.
Yeah, no,
Yeah?
the question was sort of about, thank you for all of that acknowledgement. The question was about how you situate, how you are situated in terms of your approaching this topic, the context from which you come.
Awesome, thank you. I don't love reading aloud, but I'll read a part of this aloud for y'all, because Irene, I think, wants me to. Here we go. I was also writing during a time when I was like, I was also writing during a time when I, like so many others, was under scrutiny. A time when, like the women in these pages, I too was being surveilled. When my own believability, my own ethics, my own decision-making, and my own livability were in question. Not just in question, mind you, but in question against the state and in relationship to power. Those relationships were mitigated and contoured by issues of gender, Blackness, anti-Blackness, Muslimness, disability, misfittedness, and essentially all notions of my being out of order, rank, out of line. In this kind of moment where I was, and still am, writing and trying to bring forward the stories of the women in this book, I was also living a life alongside them, revisiting, retelling, returning to proximities that we shared, and also experiencing a very different moment from what I experienced when I originally embarked upon my research as a graduate student. Not only was I not that I was more believed as a graduate student than in other contexts of my life. And looking back to my childhood and the experiences of other Black girls my age, I understood that there was never really, I understood that there has never really been a time when we've ever been afforded believability. Even as a child, there was no particular moment that I could reflexively mark where this inherent regard, believability, deservingness, and trustedness was afforded by the culture around me. What made this moment of reviewing my research different than the parallels of Black women's livabilities have been continuously and remain because of Blackness and its associated gendered logics. All of this was upon me despite being a professor or a graduate student or any given role that I was given to play. Black women have always been in a unique position in relationship to Black men, white women, white men, the state, and the broader other. It's a relationship that's been described in the academic literature and spoken about in length by many feminists and Black women and Black queer scholars. These are distinctions and particularities that have been described as they play out from a wide range of contexts, from the plantation to parliament and beyond. They've been taken up by legal discourses that have sought to divide Black women's identity and or speak to one portion of it or another, resulting in the atomization of Black women, not only in our bodies, but in the realms of policy, theory, and practice. The sequestering of us across disciplines around social and political life is culminating in what I see as in what I see and interpret as a part of the rapid death of Black people, and in many of the cases closest to me and in my personal context of Black women.
Thank you. I think for some people who haven't read the text, to gain some context for the types of violence that these women, your interlocutors, face. Maybe we could sort of, maybe you could just discuss one of the narratives of one of these interlocutors, And
Of course, yeah. So I guess one of the like really kind of prominent stories, which you'll read in the book, is from one of the interlocutors, a Black woman who was in a relationship with another Black woman. And she shares that her partner, who at the time, I guess, was had non-status, and both of them were on welfare. And so while one of the individuals who was on welfare didn't have status, the other person did, she shared with her worker that her partner was going through struggles because of CBSA. And then as a result, what ended up happening was through kind of private conversations between workers, that particular woman ended up getting arrested and then ended up having like very serious implications based on what happened to her, not even because of her immediate story, but because of her relationship to another person who was poor. And so the regulation more broadly of like poor people, which we all know, right? Like I'm not like, I don't need to write a book about that, right? Like that, the class struggle is something I think that we know about, but I think the kind of like race and gendered kind of experiences in relation to like accessing public kinds of interactions that we don't assume lead to like deportation, incarceration, the loss of your children, the loss of your home, by virtue ultimately of like class relationships that are further mitigated by race, right? And so I think that one of the first things I'd like to share with people is that like I wouldn't know these Black women unless they were poor. I wouldn't have interacted with these Black women in the very way that like myself and my mother, which you'll read about in the book, like we wouldn't have been on welfare unless we were poor. We wouldn't have lived in the hood unless we were poor, right? So poverty is certainly one kind of like entry point into like the broader conversation, but rather the nuance then of like race, state interaction, state care, state responses, state like the proximity of which each of us interacts with the state further has a relationship then of how we experience violence in relation to those interactions. Class is one of those things, right? Like class is like largely like one of the hugest ideas related to that. Insofar as the only way that we engage with like the state in many ways is regulation, care, and class, right? Like, and so we have like universal care, poverty, right? Like we have universal care, we have these particular kinds of things. And so if we already know that like no one fucks with poor people, then ain't nobody gonna fuck with like poor Black people, poor Indigenous people, poor women, poor queer people, right? Like these are additional ideas. And so when we think about that, like what permissions are given to like white poor people that aren't given to racialized, indigenized, queer, trans people that further encapsulate the capture of those people, right? And how does policy facilitate that? By virtue of like basic universal engagement. This is what ultimately like my book is about, right? And it uses the entry point of Black women, but rather like Irene like so generously shared is that we can use these critiques to kind of think about like how the state ultimately further surveils us because we're poor and then delineates that surveillance or like uniquely, creates an architecture about that surveillance then based on race, based on indigeneity and other kinds of things, right? And so the extent or the intensity to which these apparatuses are exercised are based then on, the cumulative intersections that we experience. Does that make sense? Am I making, yeah, or no? Okay, the front row is not nodding. A couple of people are nodding, okay. Well, you read it and then maybe it'll help.
Yeah, I was talking a moment ago about the acts of exposure that this text engages in and how you want to allow for certain myths, certain cultural norms to persist. And you do this in a way that is very, highly annotated. You're drawing from all kinds of previous scholarship and Black feminist scholarship, critical race theory, and Black radical tradition in general. So the text is,
it is a refusal of a whole range of neoliberal white supremacist logics. And you draw on those texts to expose these. But the other ways that you disrupt and disallow this harmful circulation is very immediate and persists in these very material examples that you provide. The undeniability of these fragments of experience, these stories of these women are really powerful. And those kinds of communications, those kinds of stories emerge from a position of trust that you had with your interlocutors. Can you talk about the process that you engaged in of enlisting them into these discussions and how you view your relationship with them? And within that, maybe the necessity of trust between you, that the structures of the academy don't necessarily have the space to negotiate or come to terms with.
Yeah, I think one of the most critical things is that I don't assume that because I'm a Black woman that it means that I'm entitled to or have access to the stories of Black women more so than other people. I'm not that simplistic, right? And so just because myself and my family had access social assistance and all the kind of really deleterious impacts of that today, and as I wrote this book, does not mean that my life in that moment as I wrote the book is similar to that of other people. And I think that what happens is this idea of I'm writing from a place of lived experience or coalesced connections. For me, it was dishonest, right? When I was writing the latter part of this text, I was a graduate student, I had a full-time job. Yeah, I was experiencing racism. I wasn't getting grants, the life was horrible. But the point is I wasn't getting $564 like the people I was talking to. And so my race could never, for me, mitigate the reality of the danger of the stories that these women were sharing, right? And I was extremely mindful in not kind of crossing that barrier or assuming that I had access to that, which I think is a really problematic thing as we think about ideas of lived experience and knowledge and oh, well, certain people should collect certain stories. Well, no, not all Black people should collect all kinds of stories from other Black people because they're Black, right? My analysis in the moment that I provided it was very different from their experiences. And I think a huge part of that was my own reflection about naming the struggle around the continuum of my own kind of I guess social and political class struggle that allowed me to really make some of those distinctions. Me writing about this doesn't have the same impact as the interlocutors who told me the story and their experiences that may essentially get them evicted from their house, may get them losing their everyday income. That's not my reality, right? I actually have the kind of permissions to go and particularly collect those stories to illuminate them for the public. If that, right? I don't know if that makes sense. And so I think that there are certain kinds of entitlements that I think many of us have to trouble, right? My politics are not the same politics as all Black people. The politics of the women in these narratives are not my politics either, right? Not all the time. And I think that we, these are some of the things that undergird this kind of random culture about access narrative and alignment and the illumination that my book is illuminating more the experiences of Black women than somebody else, right? And I guess my provocation or my offering is that I do have a particular entry point, but that entry point certainly is not the same across time and place in the way that these women were experiencing it. I don't know if I answered your question, Irene.
I think so, yeah.
I don't know. Is that?
No, I think you did contextualize your relationship between, your position and theirs quite well. I was curious about how you formed those relationships and how that trust emerged.
Totally. So I think a large part of it is that I, you know, and like I worked in these systems, right? So like I'm not innocent. You know what I mean? Like I come to know this, yes, from my own lived experience, but then I also like had at later points in my life, like the privilege of like being a person who was like a user of these services to like transitioning into thinking that like I could like better them, quote unquote. All right. Anyway, and so like I engage a lot of folks by like my own contacts. I engage folks through like sending like requests for people who'd like to engage with me in like drop-in centers, like homeless shelters, like in like my own organizing spaces. Like that's actually how I kind of like thought that interaction through. Yeah, I think like that would be like a large thing. And then like another part of it is like I live in these spaces. So like I posted my quote call for participants in the very building that I live in. Period, right? Like I live among people who are on social assistance. I choose to do that. I choose to be in that space. Like, and so I'm not saying that everybody else has to, but that was like one of like the mechanisms and vehicles, because I choose to organize where I live. And I think that's like super important for me. So a large part of that was also like having access to people who outside of like the more like dominant research space that you have to like kind of keep distant, but like that's my neighbor. Like they live on the 8th floor. So even when ethics isn't approved, like I was reading her mail 2 months before. So like what, right? Like, so I think there's like, so I think in terms of like how I access people, one, I think it's through like a kind of like problematic professionalization of care, right? And I think it's important, and I name that in the book. And then the other part of it is like through living and being, and like the livabilities of all of our struggle and our commitment to being in spaces with people who are at the intersection of like lack and disaster, right?
Thank you. You write in your introduction, you say, my intention isn't to tell people how terrible being on welfare is. We all know this. I'm not the first scholar to speak about social conditions, and I won't be the last. The intention of this book is to illustrate that none of this system of social service is about our welfare. We are not meant to fare well. Rather, the various systems that systems and people that we are instructed to believe are there to do some of the most mundane tasks, supplement our income, be our landlord, connect us to services, are actually imbued with and have the power of policing. Policing's machinations of control, its essential exercise of domination, has many branches and tendrils beyond its institutional boundaries. Its reach is vast and interlinked through systems. What I want people to think about, the question I want them to ask themselves, is why are we so committed to thinking differently about what these systems are offering, if in fact you cannot follow that commitment through to make the assertion that care in the social services sense is carceral, or that poverty is criminalized, or that Black women are criminalized and terrorized. And later in the book, you also connect this to the state and speak about this in terms of property, in terms of bodies and labor and spaces. And there's a lot of discussion these days. We hear it over and over again about the destruction of the so-called social safety net and of social systems being broken and in need of repair. Can you talk about what you're getting at here when you say these systems function as they're intended, that they're not benign or in service to everyone, but instead imbued with exercises of domination?
Yeah, I think like when we really think about like the kinds of like social services that are like particularly in this like so-called Canadian state, right? A large part of them like based on creating a social order around like, I'm speaking specifically around like social services, so stay on that vein. But it was about like social order for like Indigenous, poor, immigrant women, soul support mothers, etc. right? And so when we think about like the idea that like these systems were not meant for us to fare well, no, they were meant to regulate people who were poor, people who were like soul support mothers, people who were disabled, Indigenous peoples, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to like really make clear is even in terms of like social policy related interventions around care, for example, like, you know, the implementation of like the native child and family kinds of services, those were literally created for a delegated authority model. So therefore, like the state decided, here's what you do. We're going to tell you what to do, but we're going to kind of pretend like we're giving you the kind of delegated authority. And in terms of like a kind of policy perspective, they literally call it that, right? And so it's this kind of fictive idea that like we are giving you power, policy, and legislative authority to kind of like take care of like your own populations. However, the kind of subtext in the apparatus is like they're pulling the kind of like puppet strings, right? And so I think when I say that we're not meant to fare well, I think it's largely looking at a kind of like legal, social, and historical perspective around how we deal with sort of communities that are undesirable, right? Poor people, women, Indigenous people, disabled people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so I'm actually just saying like, let's go back to the kind of like architectures of how it is that like we're looking at responding to ideas of social safety nets, et cetera, which actually are about giving the bare minimum. So if in general, these things are about giving the bare minimum, then what happens to societies, populations, and publics that we already assume deserve less than the bare minimum, right? So we already know bare minimum is what's on offer. That's what's on the table, period. We're eating it, we're enjoying it, right? And then beyond that, the bare minimum now for an Indigenous person, for an Indigenous woman, for a Black woman, for a Black disabled woman, for a Black immigrant woman, right? That actually then further kind of like delineates what happens when there's already nothing and zero.
I'm not sure, was there supposed to be a question period during this?
Well, I don't know, but like,
I can continue, but.
well, no, I don't know.
There can
We're
be-
live and talking to each other. I'll take a question if you want to take a question, but
Yeah,
it'd be
we
nice
can
for a
maybe.
break. Your questions are intense, girl. Like, damn, like it's an essay, girl. It's an essay. Like, what do you want me to do? I already wrote the book. Leave me alone. Like, no,
Fair enough.
Irene, I'm joking. But we can take some questions. I see some people who I like their books in the space. I see some people who I love their books, anyway. But people, that's fine. Give me an easier question. Give me an easier question.
Well,
Come on.
I mean, we talked a little bit before. I mean, we could talk about. Well, I think okay. I'll okay.
Sorry, I mean, keep on the script, girl.
Do you want to talk about organizing in the Somali community of women there and how that's? Because I have a question related to that. There's that section of the text as well.
You don't need my permission. I invited you. You ask me whatever you want. I'm here for all of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the invisibilizing and inversely the hyper-visibilizing in negative ways of Black women is another, kind of thread throughout the text. And in a section of the book after discussing the organizing of Somali women, you write, and I mean, this is kind of a lengthy quote, but I think it's sort of like very relevant to the text as a whole. While it is important to acknowledge the particularities, you say, across different populations and circumstances, it is equally important to understand the longstanding pattern of marking Black women and their children as burdensome and even criminal. For as long as many of us can remember, the Canadian state has not been welcoming of Black people. We've read rhetoric about not being able to manage the cold, about ideas of lack of productivity, and about an inability to assimilate based on language differences. In fact, many of the arguments that were made specifically about Somali women can also be seen paralleled in the ways that Caribbean women who were coming to Canada in the late 1950s and 60s were also read as particularly unsafe, at times too religious and backwards, and only considered a sort of servant class of domestic help. It's important not only to address and take up these differences across Blackness, but also to highlight the ways in which Blackness surfaces repeatedly at varying intersections as a specific target for the state, considering the ways in which other Black women migrating to Canada have been treated, gives us a site of analysis and comparison from which we can talk against and move toward dismantling these false narratives and continue to emerge anew with each subsequent wave of migration. You continue, I therefore invite Canadian feminist scholars and those in policy studies and social science research, as well as policy and lawmakers, to consider, discuss, dissect, and expose the complexities of white supremacy that lie at the center of the fact that the state and its individual actors are always too ready to simply cast a new representative of Blackness into the fire. Regardless of ethnic differences amongst Black communities, it is still Black women who are the highest growing federal prison population. It is still Black youth who are overrepresented within the youth penal system, and it is Black men who are overrepresented within the provincial and federal prison systems. What becomes apparent for many Black women is that irrespective of their their specific presentation, is their Blackness that constantly acts as a marker that either excludes them or makes them hypervisible within the set of interlocking systems. You spend the section before, as I said, on the organizing of Somali women and the amazing community work there, which is also kind of alternative economic system for some, and some of the successful work that has been done in that context. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this invisibilized labor of organizers in the Somali community and how those gains and that work ends up being, benefiting larger communities as well, and how it is also submerged from public consciousness. Because I know you were talking about this earlier in the context of the QB strike and who is, on the front lines there. And
Yeah, so I guess firstly, it's really important for me to shout out John Clark, who is a huge organizer and continues to be an organizer in Toronto. So in the book, John Clark actually wrote a story about Somali women organizers, of which some of them so when John Clark was writing the story, I was a kid, or not kid, but kiddish. And it was my family organizing with this white dude who I didn't know until I'm have a university degree and all the things. And so when I remembered the work of John Clark, my other colleague, who I'm going to shout out real quick, Simon Black, reminded me of John Clark's work. And so we reached out to John Clark, who was a comrade in the struggle and doing serious work around class and labor organizing. And I really thought that John's work was crucial because it was a fragmental memory of the importance of that intervention. And I don't know that I've never actually told John that. I think I told Irene that because I wrote about John, and then I begged Irene to ask John for his little communist article, which I loved. But I thought
appears in the book,
which is in the book. So if you don't read anything else, read John's shit. John then talked about some real organizing in the city when a lot of people in Toronto, but a lot of people didn't realize that Somali women were doing deep labor and class organizing in the city, right? So that's super important. And I think I guess when I talk specifically about casting anew is that and the kind of continuities of the experiences of Black people, it's actually to say that it is Blackness, I think I say this in the book, that is castrated, condemned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We see how Blackness plays out in a whole host of contexts, including at the Polish-Ukrainian border, most recently, which I cite in the book, around we don't want you, right? Among the most deepest crisis of trying to move bodies, moving of Black bodies, a deep fucking crisis, right? And so I guess that's a part of the kind of discussion I'm coming into, but then in thinking about the kind of Canadian narrative around Black women organizers, Black women who were kind of like doing critical kinds of work, the narrative that we tend to see, and the reason why I named the sort of struggles of Caribbean women and casting anew is that that is still the kind of like sediments and like remnants of that story, right? Is the kind of like Jamaican 7, which if you don't know the story about the Jamaican 7, like working class, like Jamaican women, please go like read about it, it's important. Migrant, like the kind of like domestic and like history of like migrant workers and so forth, which I think are significantly important. But somewhere in there, there's a story lost of like how Somali women like took up labor, right? Somali women who were doing like PSW work when it was called like personal aid work, right? And even in like, you know, their kind of advocacy in the TSB, that hasn't been taken up largely because I think that there's also like dominant narratives around who gets to represent what in the context of Blackness, right? So when I talk about the idea of casting anew, it's both to like link back, connect, and like remind people that there's a kind of broader structuring to like who gets to make that story, right? Alongside our own internal struggles, I think, as like Black people to like recollect a different history here or like in Canada, so little Canada, right? And so I felt like that was one of the super important things. But I think it's the stories of like Somali women's organizing specifically to this book is like extra important because it was like not Black women who like were like welfare queens in general in Canada. It was like Somali women, right? Like that was like, think back to the 90s and like at least in Ontario, like in reference to like the Harris government, it was like these Black women who came to Canada that had like a whole bunch of kids who were Somali, right? Who went around in like Toronto and St. Catharines and like stole money, right? From these kinds of things. It was that kind of narrative around Somali women that then had the RCMP, that had CSIS, that had like Immigration Canada create specific kinds of like laws and policies about which Somalis could come to Canada because they thought everybody was a thief, right? And was coming here to steal. And I think that that's a really important story because maybe that's another book, which I think I touch a bit on that in this book. But that's a large part of like Canada's like history around responding to terrorism came from the assumption that Somali women were stealing from like welfare, right? Or the idea that people were Somalis and particularly were coming to Canada from the United States in the 90s in order to steal welfare, right? And so between the FBI and CSIS and the RCMP, they created a kind of program that surveilled specifically Somalis coming from the United States, the UK, or Sweden to Canada for welfare. So it didn't matter if that was the reason why you were coming here, but that was the kind of like legislative and like legal apparatus to keep you out or to surveil you once you got here. And that's different from any other Black population that we saw in Canada and in Ontario. I think that's important. And I think that also has to do with ideas of like Muslimness and a whole bunch of other things, right? But I take a part of that kind of history up in the book, right? Alongside like the history of why those connections would be made, given like the trend of like immigration, given like the Somali population at the time that Somalis were coming to Canada in large droves. What we also know is that 60% of the overall Somali population were Somali women. So 60% of the broader Somali population are women, then of course, you're gonna have a larger population of women and their children coming to this country or any other country, right? And that's not necessarily about like a lot of other things, but that's kind of like population demographics, right? But that has a stained narrative. That story of the single Somali refugee mother has a sustained like stain on the Canadian narrative that's really like given rise to a bunch of crap and shit, including some of like the Toronto 18 who are still like below cells in prisons in Toronto, right? Like literally below the shoe, below the cells, because they're Somali and they're Muslim, right? And so these are like, again, in the book, I talk about like the continuities of like the stories that link to how we get to like deeper and further criminalization.
Thank you.
Is that cool?
Yeah. I don't know how strict our time cutoff is. Can we take questions?
We can take some questions.
Yeah, if there's any questions out there.
Questions or comments?
For comments, yeah.
All right. Well, hello. Hi, Idil. It's wonderful to hear from you and to finally meet you in person. I think one of the points that really stuck out to me that you're talking about the idea, especially from a scholarly or academic perspective of telling narratives. And so I come from an academic background, and I think often as racialized scholars, it's sort of a twofold pressure. We feel a pressure from the academy to tell these narratives, and then we also feel our own pressures and maybe somewhat unfounded desires to tell these narratives. Which can lead to takes that maybe aren't as nuanced or, lack some of the actual connections and understandings of how it is that we tell these stories and then explain them. So I'm really curious to how you came to your particular perspective, because not only do I think it's very refreshing, it's one that I pretty much haven't heard before from other racialized scholars.
Wow, Andrew, thank you. Appreciate you. So I want to tell you, Andrew, that I really appreciate that you haven't heard that from racialized scholars before. And I'll tell you this book wouldn't have been written without racialized scholars, in particular, like Black scholars, right? So I've only come to know how to write those stories because other people wrote them before I did in different kinds of ways, right? I don't come from a place of nothing in this book is new. I think I say that in the introduction, stop reading, nothing is new. This is just my right? I'm extending and just adding a kind of really specific and I don't know what to say. I'm literally not doing anything new in the academy. I may be doing something that's being heard differently post George Floyd. I want to be really clear, really, and I say post George Floyd in so-called Canada, largely because 2 weeks before George Floyd was murdered, Regis Korchinski Paquette was killed. 2 weeks after George Floyd was murdered, DeAndre Campbell was killed, right? I'm not sure any of us know those names, but I'm sure we all know George Floyd. But the Canadian context decided that people would get cluster hires and jobs and Coca-Cola Canada and Labatt would put out messages for those people, right? And so I'm super weary of that bullshit, right? I'm also super weary of what these kinds of narratives continue to create. And so I honor that some people may not know those things, but I know that my book is only here and my thinking is only here because Black people before me thought about these things, right? So I'm not doing anything fucking special, right? Mark just decided to write my shit, put my shit in a book with a cute cover. I don't know what to say. I'm not good at kind of giving these I don't know, this is what I did in the academy. I'm fucking breaking it down. I'm not fucking doing that shit. I'm not. I'm fucking with who I fuck with. I'm getting a paycheck. I'm right? It's terrible in this fucking place. Do what you can. The fuck? I don't know what to say. I hate that I'm on YouTube, be talking like this, but shit, I don't no. Nothing special is happening here. The book was written. People did it before me. I added to it. The book is there. Academia is shit and trash. I don't know what to say. I don't know.
No, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about, because even within the academy, everything has to be a contribution.
Yeah.
Right? Every single paper you write, what is the contribution to the literature? What is this and that? And so there's this
concept that we're creating new knowledge all the time, even if it's iterative of old knowledge, it has to then become,
Absolutely.
and that is it's so harmful, and even if you think you're creating new knowledge, if that just overwrites old knowledge, then that's not actually helpful to the pursuit of knowledge, right?
100%.
So I think your answer is perfectly clear, and that's what I'm talking about.
I have no shame about extending. I have no shame about adding my little boop.
Yeah.
Listen, I have no shame about that. It means I've read, it means I've engaged, right? Like, and that's absolutely okay. And I think that's the idea of, like, you have to contribute to this thing. You have to have something new to say, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know that I don't know that anybody necessarily has anything new to say, but I think that we all have a nuanced perspective. And I think that that's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Despite what anybody else says, right? And I don't ever want to contribute to anything without like a collective kind of history of what I'm contributing to, because I think that's scary. Thank you, Andrew, for your question.
Were there any other questions locally?
Hi, nice meeting you in person. I guess my question is.
Wait, what's your name? You know my name. What's your name?
Oh, my name is Fadi.
Fadi. What is it?
Fadi Anna.
Fadi, nice to meet you, Fadi.
Nice meeting you. My question, I guess, is so you talked a bit about this triple consciousness, like you're dealing with race, class, and gender, especially and your criminalization with the women that you're talking about. It can be quite difficult, stressful. You echo some of this. And yeah, how do you find care or healing, if that's the word, during this time, I guess, and that keeps you going? Because yeah, it's a lot of work that literally understate, but sometimes it's quite not recognized, and you go to a lot of circles where you don't have all these Somalis to come listen and pay tribute to what you've done too. So yeah, I think there's a lot that you've contributed to the literature as well, but that's another segue. Thank you.
Aww, thank you, Fadi. Yeah. Shout out to you for your kindness. Thank you. I was so like engulfed in your kindness and generosity that I may have missed. Like, give me like a prompt for the question, like a prompt.
How do you find healing when you're doing all these difficult interviews and work?
I guess healing would mean that whatever I'm writing about or experiencing would be over, right? So to heal, I guess for me, and I don't know, like I'm not a healing expert, but like, I guess I interpret healing as like the kind of reparative to what's happening. So I don't know that like I'm healing when like we're in class and race wars here. You know what I mean? Like we're throwing elbows out here. I don't have time to heal.
That's why I'm asking for tips.
Like, I think I don't have tips, but I'm going to tell you this. I'm not prepared to heal just yet because I'm in a war, right? I may be wounded right now, so I'm out here in the struggle. I'm looking for the nurse to like patch up the wound so I can keep doing what I'm doing, right? I think that there's like a kind of like introspective healing that needs, like, not healing, but like consciousness that needs to happen to understand why we're doing what we're doing. But I can't heal yet because the wounds are fucking bleeding. I can't heal yet because people aren't eating. I can't heal yet because, like, you know, our government is fucking killing people. I can't heal yet because like MAID is happening and people are dying. Like, you know what I mean? Like, how can I can't get to healing because we are literally amidst a fucking war right now. Like, people are bleeding out. Like, the world is like climate crisis, like all the things, right? So for me, I'm doing that kind of internal work, but like, I don't have time for that, period. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That was like horrible, like non-social working, nice person answer. Like,
No, that's fair.
Thank you, Fadi, for your question.
And we do have time for one more question before I throw things back to you folks for your closing comments.
Yay! I was waiting for your question.
I know. Thank you so much for this. This is really wonderful.
Say your name.
My
I know,
name is-
I know who you are, but say your name.
My name is Cam.
Hi, Cam.
Hi. Good to meet you, see you, hear you. Yeah, this is so rich, but I'm thinking there's this incredible, very broad demand that issues from a very particular standpoint in Black life, where the health and the thriving and maybe like the survivance, to import a word from a decolonial vernacular of Black people, exerts a test upon politics, policy, any possible social formation, and that we can fail these institutions by how well Black people thrive in them and by them. And clearly social assistance is failing this test, this powerful test, right? But then I think about this other great twist, that Black women are not meant to fare well under this system, as if actually where Black women do not fare well, the system is working by a different standard. It's working very well.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Cam.
For some people, and I appreciate, I've only just grabbed it, so I haven't had time to digest the modesty at the end of this book. You say you're not making grand claims, and what I hear tonight, maybe you don't really want to make those at the expense of other people's lives and experience, and I super appreciate that care. But at the same time, telling these stories, I think it does exert a demand, and I'm really fixated on the problem of the state, where there's these apparatuses and these services that cause harm, and that we're fighting to expand and defend in other respects.
Thank you.
And I sort of wonder about the political horizon that this book projects, where that difficulty is concerned. That's a very lofty question. I apologize.
It's not lofty, but it's a critical, important question. Thank you so much, Cam. Also, read Cam's book. Just saying, another art person. Thank you so much for that, Cam, because I think that what's really happened is this the based idea of reallocating funds to essentially other social orders, state-based institutions, social work, mental health, we just want more Black prison guards and more Black cops and more Black fucking social workers. No, we don't want that. These are systems of social order. We need to undo them. We need to dismantle them. And I think that when, I appreciate your question insofar as, for me, my book also further asks for those who make these kinds of claims to reallocate funds. What are you actually saying? Actually. Because some of us worked in those things, some of us have tried that, we know what's actually happening. So being mobile, it's mobile crisis, it's not 911. No, it's still 911, because ultimately it is the state that has to deal with people who are dangerous, right? And so I guess for me, the large part of it is it's not about divesting or redirecting, it's about absolutely undoing. And I think one of the things I don't remember much from this book, to be honest, but what I do remember, the one thing I remember is I think on page 13, I said I don't want to teach my students or anybody else to do anything but unfucking do the shit. That's it. I'm not that's not the place that I'm in, because I think that making some of those recommendations are actually very premature and unstudied, dangerous, to be honest, right? And I don't think that those are radical positions. I don't think that those are useful positions. I think that they're unstudied and useless positions, right? So when people, ask me, what or how, I'm not thankful because you read the book. You need to do something with it. You need to, right? I'm not here to share information. Google does that, right? Instagram and Twitter exists, right? That's not my intention. My intention is that a kind of evocation for practices of refusal, direct practices of refusal, direct practices of undoing, direct practices of like organizing. Like, I'm not one of these activists or like authors or scholars who's gonna be like, thank you for critically reflecting and engaging. No, I don't have time for that. Don't read my shit if that's what you wanna do, right? Like, go read like something on like Tumblr. I want you to do something with what I'm telling you because the situations are imminent, they're urgent for these people. Like, they actually are urgent. So I want you to think about like what happens when you're walking down the street and you think about someone as dangerous. I want you to like interrupt that response, but then I also want you to, as you like further walk down the street and you see someone getting arrested, to fucking intervene, right? And then I want you to tell people that you intervened and why you did. Then I want you to like fucking contact a person and be like, oh my God, I saw this thing happen on the street and I'm sending you this email. And I don't care if you're like a mom or like not an organizer or you're not woke, like you are an organizer if you send that email. You are important if you intervene on that street. Like, you don't need, I didn't organize at first with anybody, right? Quote unquote, like organizing means doing something. Organizing is not a title, right? And I think what's happened is an organizer has become a title, and also like an affiliation and like a kind of accolade. And what I want to say is we all participate in the social world, and every single thing that you do, including interrupting the person at Shoppers Drug Mart that's getting treated like shit, or at the LCBO, or at fucking Home Depot, like that matters. Like, that shit fucking matters. You don't need to be a part of a group. You don't need to be on a Signal chat or on a Google Doc or on a Slack fucking shit. You just need to get your shit together and do what the fuck you gotta do. And that's that, cancel. That's my answer. And the story. Somebody not maybe a good answer. Is that okay? Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Frank.
And I don't know if you have anything more to add after that by way of closing, but that was a pretty tremendous way to end the evening regardless. But if either of you have any closing comments at all, please feel free.
I don't. I love that final note that, you know, organizing is not an identity that you enter into. It's just, you know, acting and doing. Thank you, Idil, so much. Thank you, John and McNally, and everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
And I can add nothing further tonight. That was an excellent way of closing down. So thank you both so very much. We'll now be moving along to the signing. So please feel free to visit Idil just behind this table here. Get copies of either book signed before you pay for them. Just remember to pay for the books before you physically leave.
I'm dead. John said pay for the books.
At some point or other.
I'm dead.
Thank you all so very much for joining us. And once again, please join me in thanking ARP, Irene Bindi, and of course, Idil Abdillahi. Thank you all so very much.